mass brief as basic stools. It's kind of like part B of the mass brief. But usually this would be a completely separate briefing and a completely separate lesson on another day. So get to know whatever organisation you work for, what they do. It's pretty normal for it to come straight after basic stools, and I've never heard of an organisation deferring it to later on, but hey, there may be some out there that do that. You will see there's a lot of repetition in this mass brief when you compare it to the basic stools one, so use it as an opportunity to ask questions. There should be a lot of time when you don't have to say much in this briefing. Let's talk about the instructional technique stuff first. So I mentioned that it's got a different name. Check with the organisation around where it's actually taught in their syllabus. I'll give you an idea of the intro when I present it. Tell you objectives will look very similar. In fact, they're almost identical. There are a few differences. Revision based, so ask some questions around this, because this is just exactly the same as from the basic stools part. This should be a bit of a recap, not a lot of new things on slide 4. What am I doing? I'm on the wrong, there with me, I'm in the wrong place. Here we go. So straight from the basic stool stuff here, so ask some questions around that. Draw on what they learned in the previous briefing and also what they should have experienced in the previous stalling flight as well. Let us assume for this briefing that they have gone away and done the basic stall flight as well, so you can rely on them having that knowledge. This is revision, so question based here, you don't need to do all the talking. And then your link basically from this slide to the following ones is that the stall speed is not set, it varies, and that leads you into all the different factors which you can talk about one at a time. So we'll go through all of those. This slide here, I mean, I normally talk a little bit about slats and slots, more so slots because they are actually reasonably common in general aviation. Slats are not, so it's just a brief mention of their effect. You could draw up a little diagram to show how a venturi is formed with the slot, so I'll demonstrate that for what I do. Otherwise, just describe it. But remember, you've introduced them to a venturi and the effect of them, so they should know that. Then there's a couple of slides, which probably the same ones from the ancillary controls lesson around the effects of flap. So what's happening to the camber, what's happening to the lift, and why. And then you get a summary. This should all just be revision based, so ask them how these factors affect the stall speed. You could give them scenario based questions here rather than just say, you know, what's the effect of weights, you know. Ask them a question like, hey, if you were going up to practice stalls on your own, what do you think the stall speed would be compared to when you and I did it? So maybe you could ask targeted questions. This should all be revision. Is there anything new there? No, but this is an opportunity for you to ask them how they found basic stalls. You'll probably know, because let's assume that you were the student's primary flight instructor, so if they were terrified, you're going to know that, but if they were pretty at ease, you'll also know that. But just ask them, get them talking about it. There's a lot of apprehension around stalling lessons, which maybe was talked about in the basic stalls part. So you just want to make sure that they're at ease and that reassure them that there is nothing extreme about this lesson. Different nose attitudes compared to basic stalls, but still nothing extreme. This should be relatively straightforward as well, lots of revision. Maybe this is an additional thing to talk about, the flap speeds. This is all revision, so just questions. And then you go into the year exercise. This slide here is just for comparison, so it leads you into the next couple. So because part of this exercise is comparing the effect of power and flap on the nose attitude and stall speed, you just want to start here and by saying, so this is what the nose attitude might look like. This is what the speed may be for a basic stall at the onset. Then you compare it with these ones here. And then combined, nothing really I need to tell you there. The entry, the recovery, and the conclusion, I would treat mostly as revision. So what I like to do is I get my student to come up to the whiteboard and I get them to write on the whiteboard the recovery from a basic stall, because as you're sure you're already aware, there's very little difference in the recovery from an approach stall or a basic stall. There's just a few differences, like when to raise flap. Essentially it's the same. So if they can tell you what the recovery from a basic stall is, all you have to do is insert raise flap at a few places or extend flap at a few places in the entry, and then it's fairly easy. So revision based. You don't need to do all the talking. If you're doing it on the whiteboard over there, if you're getting them to draw it all up, then it should be fairly quick to come back to the slide. I like to go through the symptoms before the recovery, so maybe on the other half of the whiteboard ask them to write down the symptoms. Do they remember what they were? What do you remember from the basic stall slide? Talk about what order they come up in, because inevitably the student writes them all in the wrong order and they'll say, oh, the nose pitch is down, and then we get Buffett and it's all wrong. So it is quite important to have them in the correct order. And some symptoms are specific to particular types of aircraft and particular types of stalls. So that should be revision based. And then it's your choice where you go with this conclusion slide. I would just ask a few targeted questions about some of the things that you've already talked about in this briefing. So it shouldn't be a difficult briefing to deliver. Lots of revision. I don't think there's really any other instructional things I need to mention to you. Everyone see that okay? If you can't, just close the blinds. So for an intro for this one, get them talking, ask them about how they found the basic stalls lesson. Highlight here that this is stall lesson number 2 of about 5 that they're going to look at in their training here to become a competent pilot in identifying the symptoms, being able to recover. So it's just another step to give them a very full, well-rounded picture of the stall. Last time we had a look at the symptoms of an approaching stall. We experienced the stall, we learned the standard recovery, and we started developing confidence around identifying a stall and recovering from it. Remember, with the end goal that we should never accidentally stall an aeroplane. We should have sufficient awareness that the aeroplane is getting close to its minimum speed. So today is a lot of revision on basic stalls, but we are going to have a look at the effect of power and flap, specifically on the nose attitude and on the stall speed. So an intro like that is fine. Here are our objectives. So you'll notice there's a lot of similarities today with your basic stalls lesson. So have a read of those. So the first one there, just the same as basic stalls, except now we're adding power and flap. The second one is exactly the same. We should never accidentally stall an aeroplane. But the big new thing today is we're going to learn the factors that affect the stall speed. So thinking back to your last lesson, do you remember what the stall speed was? Ask those sorts of questions. get them talking. And then lead into your next slide with what is a stall. So, ask them to define what the stall speed was for the DA40. Is that the speed that you saw the aeroplane actually stall at last time? Oh, what was it then? Use that as a basis for this briefing. If they can't remember, then you're going to have to go back and recap on this stuff. Remember, there may have been some time in between them doing the basic stalls lesson and actually doing this one. So be prepared to actually have to guide them through this. But otherwise you're just going to run through this. Relate this, what is going on here, to that previous lesson. So even though we couldn't see this happening last time we did basic stalls, this is what was going on around the wing. And you actually felt this turbulent flow breaking off the wings and, meeting the horizontal stabilizer. You probably felt that shuddering through the flight controls. That was that turbulent wake there. So draw on things they've already learned. Carrying on with your stall speed discussion. Ask them what a stall speed actually is. See if they remember. Another click will bring you to this slide. Do they remember what the lift formula was? Run through this with them if you need to. But remember, the stall speed is the minimum level flight speed, and it should correspond with the highest possible angle of attack. So another couple of clicks will bring all of that up. Angle of attack in camber, we're saying that's at a maximum, and the speed is at a minimum. The minimum level flight speed. So last time, in the basic stalls briefing, you may have introduced them to the flight manual. If you didn't, that's fine, but I usually show them in the flight manual where they can find all of the stall speeds, because it leads quite nicely into this briefing. So ask them, if you haven't done so here, what the basic stall speed is. What did they see last time? So what are we highlighting here? The aeroplane always stalls at the critical angle of attack. Sometimes the speed at which it stalls is predictable, but it varies depending on a number of factors, which we're now going to talk about. And another click would bring you to the weight one here. What I generally do is I explain, or I talk about what I want to before I do any more clicks here. So relate it back to straight and level flight. They've learned that in order for an aeroplane to be in straight and level flight, lift has to be equal to weight. So tell a bit of a story. I always say, well, let's imagine that today Michael and I are out doing approach stalls, and Kate sat in the back, she's monitoring. We've got quite a lot of fuel on board, so it's quite a heavy DA40, and Vic's out there today practicing these stalls on his own. There's no one else on board, there's minimal fuel, just what he needed for the lesson, so the aeroplane's a lot lighter. And do you remember what the simplified lift formula is? I tend to write it up here because you're going to refer back to it a lot for these factors. So they'll say, oops, hopefully they remember that. Lift equals angle of attack times indicated airspeed. And we're also saying that in order to be in straight and level flight, weight had to be equal to lift. So I usually just throw that in there as well. So let's now talk about the differences between that heavier DA40 and the lighter one. So if we have an increase in weight, that means we're going to need more lift in order to keep the aeroplane in level flight. Let's say that whilst Vic is practicing these stalls and Michael's practicing them, both aircraft are right on the verge of the stall, so we're already at the critical angle of attack. So we cannot get any more lift by increasing the angle of attack. So what's the only other thing we can do? We can fly faster. So what does this mean? This means that the heavier aeroplane has a higher stall speed. Its minimum level flight speed is increased. Weight is probably the big reason why when we did basic stalls, you did not see the aeroplane stall at 53 knots as the flight manual says it should. Usually stalls at like 48, somewhere around there. So highlight that, because all of a sudden you've just given them a really important answer. Then you could come back to the the board here and run through this. So if we increase the weight, we increase the lift, that is required, I mean. We have to fly faster in order to get that lift if we're already at the critical angle, and this means that the stall speed will rise. The more weight we add, the higher the stall speed will be. Nice and simple, right? This should be similar to what the stall package was from last semester. I don't remember if I presented that or someone else does, but this, I love this formula, okay? It works so well for many of the factors here. So another factor we have is icing and damage. Now, remember they're a new student, and if you guys were new students, you haven't yet had a winter with us, so and when we do have winters here, you'll see that our aeroplanes get frost on them. And we never go flying with ice or any frost attached to the aircraft. And there's two effects. One of them is that the ice adds weight. Now you often see a student sort of scoff at that, thinking, oh, it can't possibly weigh that much. And perhaps on a DA40 it doesn't, but I used to fly at Ruapehu, and the frosts that we got were severe, and I remember some days there would be an inch of ice stuck to all surface of the aeroplane. Now that does add up to a reasonable amount of weight. But you know, it's not just about light aeroplanes, it's about bigger aeroplanes. So you imagine an A380 completely covered in ice. That is going to be a lot of weight. So the stall speed rises because of that. But back in effects of controls in straight and level, we talked about how lift is dependent on there being a nice smooth streamlined surface of an aerofoil. Does that look like a streamlined and smooth surface to you? No, it doesn't, does it? It's rough. What that's going to do is encourage the airflow to separate earlier from the wing at a higher speed. So this will mean your stall speed rises. It's also possible from time to time that there may be some damage to the wings of the aeroplane. And so we always, during the pre-flight phase, check the wings for any dents, and you always report those to your instructor. We certainly wouldn't want to see a pair of seagull legs or whatever they are poking out of the front of the wing, or a drone stuck to the leading edge of the wing like that. So once again, does that look aerodynamic to you? No. So that's going to encourage the airflow to separate earlier at a higher airspeed. So try to tell some stories as you go through this, hence why I talk about we actually do get frosts here, so it is something that they have to consider. As an instructor, always be very careful of that. You know, sometimes a student goes out to pre-flight and you ask them, any ice? No ice. And you go out there and there is ice on the aeroplane. And there may actually not have been ice when they did the pre-flight, but it can always form afterwards. So you always want to make sure you check the aeroplane as you walk out to it. Just run your hands along it, make sure there's no ice adhering to it, okay? SOPs wise, remember we have the little bit of guidance that you can move the aeroplane to face it into the sun. You can flip it around if you need to, but always bring it back onto the line, parked straight before you start the engine up. We don't start up at an angle. So here's a good place to actually introduce them to that SOP as well. I don't personally bother with the formula for icing and damage. I don't think it's necessary. It does help for your next factor, loading. One click is going to bring up all of this, so you could bring that up, that's fine, or you might want to just pause on this slide and give loading a bit of an intro. That's up to you, okay, I don't care. It's just what I tend to do. So another factor that increases the stall speed is what we call load factor. I usually say something along the lines of, hey, do you remember back when we did your effects of controls, I showed you a really steep turn, because we actually do that sometimes, and do you remember feeling like you were being pushed down into your seat? Well, that is called load factor. Load factor is a measure of the extra lift required to keep an aeroplane in level flight. In other words, lift divided by weight. Hey, we did medium turns the other day. What did you learn about the lift in a medium turn? Oh, it had to increase. So that means the load factor increases. There's more lift than weight. We experience this as an increase in the apparent weight. We can sometimes feel that. If you've ever been on a roller coaster, done a loop or a really steep turn on the roller coaster, you've probably also felt like you're being squished down into your seat. That is another version of loading. So tell some stories like that, okay? I don't know what your instructors did with you, but I always showed my students a steep turn or a max rate turn. They always quite enjoyed it. You just careful of motion sickness though, but you know, you do these things with students to add interest and everything. So after explaining the basics of that, I mean, another click does bring up this formula, so don't feel like you have to keep writing it on the whiteboard. You can if you want, and then just skip past it. But what we're saying here is a new scenario. Let's say we are back to doing a basic stall again. We've slowed right down to the critical angle of attack, but now we want to turn. When we turn, it increases the apparent weight, therefore we need more lift. But let's say we're already at the critical angle of attack. We need more lift, we can't get it from angle of attack, so how do we get it? We have to fly faster. So therefore the minimum speed for level flight is increased. The stall speed rises in a turn. I've just remembered something I like to say on the weight slide. Tell your student and show them perhaps at the end of the flight that in the flight manual there is a section that gives you the stall speeds for different weights. Don't forget that, because you can also say the same thing here. There is a section in the flight manual that shows you the stall speed at different angles of bank. So there's no reason why we can't start introducing them to some of the aircraft documentation as we go through these mass briefs. I wouldn't normally grab the flight manual out at this point, but perhaps at the end of it, at the end of the briefing, you could have a sit down and show them where to find all that information. It's important to normalise this stuff early on. So that should be very much the same as the stall package from last semester as well. So the formula works quite nicely here. So you link to the next slide. So we've had a look at the three different factors that increase the stall speed, but there are a few factors that reduce the stall speed. So that's what we're going to have a look at now. And one of those is power. Just don't click any more than that, because the next thing is going to bring up all the slipstream stuff. So there's an opportunity for a question here. So ask them what they remember about slipstream, or a targeted question if you like. Hopefully they remember, oh yeah, it's an accelerated airflow that flows back from the propeller over the surfaces of the wings. That's the important bit, not the fact that it increases the effectiveness of some of the controls. So another click there and we'll bring that up. So that slipstream increases the speed of the airflow over the inboard sections of the wings and delays separation. So this will mean that we can fly at a slower airspeed but still produce sufficient lift to support the weight. So the stall speed is reduced. Another effective increased power is that it allows us to have a higher nose attitude at the stall. So in the little animation here on the slide, let's imagine we're right at the critical angle of attack, but I've set full power. The nose attitude is going to be much higher than what you experienced in the basic stall. And now there's a small component of thrust, what we call the vertical component of thrust, which acts in the same direction as the vertical component of lift. And this actually reduces the requirement of the wings to produce lift. Another click will bring up your little formula here. So anything that reduces the requirement of the wings to produce lift means that the stall speed will reduce. So let's imagine again that we're at the critical angle of attack already. What it means is now we can slow down, still producing sufficient lift to support the weight of the airplane. My summary here is usually the more power we have on, the higher the nose attitude will be at the stall, and the lower the stall speed can be. I remember once when I was learning to fly, my instructor showed me a full power basic stall. Not particularly nice, like the nose attitude is way up there somewhere, full power right at minimum speed. So that's probably the reason why we don't teach it, or one of the reasons, because that's going to scare the shit out of them. And the second thing is, if it actually stalls aggressively with full power on, it's going to roll and yaw really quickly, wing drop or spin. So there's several reasons why we don't do that. It's actually quite a useful exercise in aerobatics though, because it really teaches the student to use their feet. They've got to make sure they're not using any aileron because push it right at the critical angle. But if they use their feet, they can keep the nose pointed really quite high and prevent it from stalling at full power. You just need to close the throttle rather quickly when it does stall. Okay, so that's that one. Now there's another factor which reduces the stall speed as well, and those are slots, slats and flaps. Now, have you ever seen those videos on YouTube of the jumbo jets landing at, what's it, St. Martin or Princess Juliana Airport in the Caribbean? I think it's quite a short runway. It's about the size of Wellington, I think, 2,000 odd metres, and they land these huge 300 odd ton jumbo jets in there. Now, how are they able to do that? And it was through the use of these slats, slots and flaps. So big aeroplanes have these leading edge slats, extensions that come out of the leading edge. They have flaps, just like a DA40, but they have a particular type of flap called a slotted flap. Now, you might be able to see it. There's little gaps running through sections of these flaps here. So they have slotted flaps. All of these things increase the lift. So you could ask questions about this, because remember you've talked to them about flaps before, haven't you? So these are high lift devices, and they allow an aeroplane to take off and land at slower speeds. That's how the jumbo jets can use these short runways. Up to you whether you explain this now or later, but this is where I normally briefly talk about slots. So I usually draw a little diagram. You don't even have to draw a diagram. Something like that to show both a slat and a slot. And show the airflow going through there. So then you're really just relating it back to what they learned in effects of controls, wasn't it? Venturi or ancillary controls, whichever one it was. Ask them a few questions about that. So you can say to them, so what's actually formed here is a Venturi. Hey, do you remember what happened to the speed of an airflow when it went through a Venturi? What happened to the pressure? And what was lift dependent on? The difference between the pressure above and below a wing. So what these little gaps do is they increase the difference in pressure and they increase the lift, and this reduces the stall speed. So up to you whether you draw that. You could just describe it. I always think a picture tells 1,000 words though. Unfortunately, we don't have slots in our aeroplanes. Plenty of general aviation aeroplanes, light aeroplanes do, not us though, but we do have flaps. So let's spend the rest of this part actually talking about what's practical to us. So a DA40 has what are known as plain flaps, and we've got a small split section as well, right down at the root of the wing there. So do you remember what happens to the airflow when we extend flap? Ask some questions like that. Hopefully they remember, camber increases, airflow accelerates, more lift. That's all you're looking for here, okay? Another click will bring up this just to really highlight the differences in the camber. So here is a DA40 wing with the flap raised. That's the green dotted line representing the camber. And then with flap in the landing position, here's the camber now. So much greater curvature, bigger difference in pressures above and below the wing means more lift, stall speed is reduced, so we can fly at a slower speed. Again, just straight from your stall package from last semester. At this point, you're ready to summarize everything. So this should just be questions. So again, it's up to you whether you just run through each individual factor or ask them a more targeted question, but tell them that this is a really helpful acronym or mnemonic, I never remember which is which, but a helpful way of remembering all the factors. WILPS. So click brings that up. Ask them what happens when we increase the weight, or give them some sort of scenario like I said before. You know, well, what if you're going out practicing stalls today on your own versus Michael, Kate and I? Who will stall at the lower speed and why? Assesses their comprehension. More questions. Okay, I'll skip through this because I've given you some ideas for this. You can just as easily draw this up on the board or get them to come up here and write up the different factors. Just mixes things up rather. May not be a great way to do it if you've got a big class, but if this is a one-on-one briefing, particularly if it's a pre-flight briefing, I always get my students to come up and write things on the board as I sit down. Now this, as I said, should just be revision. So ask them some questions around this. Hey, do you remember what height we had to recover by? Just listen very carefully. Make sure they say height and not altitude, because there's a difference between those two. And whilst we could probably use those terms synonymously in the southern training area, we can't out to the north, right? So that's where it is going to become particularly important. What have we got next? I can't read it. Prominent reference points. Yeah, so that should be revision, but just highlighting there that actually situational awareness is really important. We're going to have a high nose attitude, visibility is reduced, related to what they saw last time. Can't really see where we're going, so we always want to make sure we position the aeroplane in a safe place before we carry out any stalls, not facing any terrain, not getting ourselves tangled up in any cloud, or right on the boundary of our training area or airspace. We have to think about these things first. And with a high nose attitude, you know, you want a prominent reference point that's high in the sky. Some people like to use something down the side of the cowling. That's fine, but you just don't want to pick something straight ahead because you're going to lose sight of that, right? This is where you could ask them about motion sickness. So, hey, how did you find the basic stalls last time? Nothing scary, was it? Nothing extreme, just a relatively high climb attitude. Even the stall itself wasn't scary. We're not falling out of the sky or anything ridiculous. It's just like a descent. So really normalize it, because I don't know if any of you can relate, but plenty of students have preconceived ideas of what a stall is because they've seen documentaries like Air Crash Investigation where these things are plummeting out of the sky, and that's just not what happens, eh? We're not falling out of the sky. Highlight the significance of lookout. We can't see where we're going with the high nose attitude, so we must have a thorough lookout before we actually set up for the stall. And like the basic stalls, we want to overlearn this procedure. We want to memorize the recovery so that if we ever find ourselves inadvertently in a stall situation, we know how to recover without even having to think about it. It becomes a motor skill. We also want to develop that kind of awareness with the symptoms as well. Largely revision based. I like to highlight this in the basic stalls briefing as well, but where a student scares the shit out of themselves in these lessons is because they're way too aggressive in the recovery. When we say check forward in the recovery, tell the student what you really mean by that is more of a relaxation of the back pressure, because what you don't want to do is see them doing this, because then the nose attitude is going to end up facing straight down. And they'll pull a whole heap of negative G and probably throw up, and they'll scare themselves and they'll forever be apprehensive about doing these from then on. So think of it as a relaxation of the pressure when we go to recover. Highlighting that we must stay within our training area boundaries here. So it really comes to the Hazel checks and Hell checks a little bit later on, well, probably in the next slide, I suppose. But we don't want to interfere with someone else's training area. It's a high concentration exercise, and we want the student to be focused just on flying the aeroplane. So this housekeeping stuff is really important. You could ask them some questions about VFE. So today's lesson, we are actually going to be looking at stalls with flap extended. So we're going to need to make sure we don't extend the flap above the VFE speeds. Hey, do you remember what they are? And we also need to remember in the recovery to raise the flap before we get to those speeds as well. So questions, ask them. Questions here as well. We want to monitor the temperatures and pressures to ensure they stay within the normal operating green range. And then you could ask them, what are these checks? The very next click will bring them all up, so you could run through them one by one. They should be able to tell you. Maybe you just add some information if you need to. What I sometimes do with students is if you're changing the type of stall, I go back and actually just do the whole Hazel check again. You don't have to do that, but I find if you are changing, say, from a basic stall to an approach stall, you use different power settings, you use different flap settings, so it may be prudent to actually go back and do the whole thing again. It'll only take a few seconds, but that's your discretion. This one here, the security, by the stage the students up to this lesson, you should have introduced them that in the pre-flight, they don't just throw the control lock on the back seat or in the footwell. Everything should be stowed properly. It's unusual that things would get dislodged and fly around, but that is what could happen if we entered an unusual attitude. So make sure everything is stowed properly. Good habits right from the start. Really emphasize this stuff. I see students so often not give enough consideration to some of these variables, and we start stalling in amongst cloud, and we enter an unusual attitude because they've got no visible horizon. That's not the aim of this exercise. Make it easy for them, okay? If we can't get to a suitable altitude, then don't do the lesson today. Or maybe we can descend below the cloud and still have sufficient altitude. Lookouts, more questions here. You don't have to keep doing 360-degree turns or 180. A couple of 90-degree turns or even just one is absolutely fine, but always think about keeping yourself in your training area. So the year exercise, what we're going to look at today. So we're going to start with a bit of a recap on a basic stall. So I'll just analyse you doing one of these today. What I want you to pay particular attention to is what the nose attitude looks like and what the speed is when we feel the buffer. For today's lesson, we're going to make all of our recoveries at the onset, which is at the buffer. Don't forget to define that. It should have been done in the basic stalls briefing, but just remind them what the onset is, because different organisations treat it as different things. For example, in Cessnas, they don't typically get much buffer. So we use the stall warning as the onset, but the stall warning has several different tones to it. There's about 2 tones. We use the second tone as the onset for most Cessnas. So make sure you qualify that. So we're going to note the nose attitude at the onset as well as the speed. And we'll note that that speed's probably not going to be 53 knots, because we're not at all up weight, but it'll be an important reference speed for us that we want to be aware of. Nothing extreme, okay, really coming back to that. There's nothing unusual about the nose attitudes we're using. They should just be like a normal climb attitude. Then I'll demonstrate to you a stall with power. Once again, we'll recover at the onset and we'll note the nose attitude as well as the stall speed. And we'll note that the nose attitude's a little bit higher this time and the stall speed is a couple of knots slower. So remember, the more power that we have on, the higher that the nose attitude will be at the stall, and also the lower that the speed can be. But nothing extreme. Still just looks like a high nose attitude, such as in a climb. Maybe like the best angle of climb speed, what it looks like. I'll demonstrate to you a stall using flap without any power. Once again, recovering at the onset, noting the nose attitude, and have a look at this. It's actually quite a low nose attitude this time. We can see a lot more at the onset. And the stall speed will be reduced slightly compared to the basic stall. The more flat we set, the lower the nose attitude will be, and the lower the stall speed can be as well. Then we're going to combine them both and have a look at a stall recovering at the onset with both power and flap set. So what we're simulating here is a stall, when we are, say, coming into land, as you know, we have some power set, we have flap set, and we're simulating that. Perhaps we've stalled on final approach, maybe we've stalled in a go-around, or maybe it's even in the climb-out just after taking off. So always give them some context to this. So why does this even relate to them? What phases of flight is this most likely to occur? It is those phases that I've just identified. So we'll note here that with some power on and with some flap set, the nose attitude actually looks very similar to what it was for a basic stall. The effects tend to negate each other, but the stall speed will be slightly lower than it was for the basic stall, because we're gaining the benefit of both power and flap. So now we're going to talk about the specifics of entering and the symptoms as well as the standard recovery. So this is where I get them to come up and actually write out the thing up there. If you don't want them to write it out, that's fine, but get them to tell you what it is, because at this stage, having done a stall lesson and having told them in the maths brief and in the debrief that, right, now you need to go away and memorize this recovery. They should have done that. Look, they're always going to make mistakes, but see how well they've actually retained all of that. So then you're going to run through all of this, okay? I'll just bring it all up, because it's really very similar to a basic stall. A few things to expand on. What you can say here is they reduce the power, make sure they keep straight, or ask them a question and say, what will you need to do in order to maintain your reference point there? Oh yeah, use a bit of rudder. Ask that question. They should have learned that in the basic stall. Even though we say 12 inches, when I teach this in the air, I tell them a little trick. If they actually bring the power back to 10 inches, it rises back to 12 as you slow down. You don't have to teach that. Okay, we're still going to say set 12 inches, but in the air, that is a useful technique. Otherwise, what you find is it increases up to 12 or 14, even 16 inches, and then they're looking inside, bringing the power back when they should be looking outside. So this is a little technique that you can use. Your discretion. Maintain altitude and direction. So this is where you need to expand a bit more, because we don't go straight to landing flap, do we? We set the takeoff flap below 108 knots. Always tell the student, make sure you're below that speed by at least 5 knots, trending down. As you extend the flap, you'll have to check forward slightly in order to maintain your altitude. As the aircraft continues to slow down below 91 knots, set the landing flap. Below 80 knots, set high RPM. So run through that. Just expand on the differences, that's all, okay? Now up to you whether you go through the symptoms. I like to, because it tells me how much they've remembered from last time. And remember, the symptoms are the way that they will prevent an inadvertent stall. They have to be aware of those. So I always think it's a good exercise. So let's go through those. So what are they in order as best you can? Cool. A low and decreasing airspeed. Let's hear at least one from every single one of you. Cool.
Noise.
Sorry?
Noise. It's quieter.
Yes, you can mention that. I do tend to talk to them about it, because it's definitely something they want to be aware of, but it's not always a symptom, eh? Actually, most of these things are not always going to be a symptom, but yep.
High nose attitude.
Good. So, why is there reduced noise?
Because you're slowing down, there's less air flying over the aeroplane.
What else?
Buffet.
Yep. Now that's going to be a bit further down on the day, so I'll put it up there, but that's going to be down here. Why is there buffeting? These kind of questions are not always going to be ones you can ask your student, but you guys should know.
Because the separates and it hits the horizontal stabilizer at the tail.
Yep. What about the buffet generators?
Yeah, those as well.
Yep. What else?
Just control effect.
Good. And why is that? Good. So they should know that one. They've learned about that before. What else?
Stall.
Stall warning. When does that come on?
I think just before the
Typically 5 to 10 knots prior to the stall in most airplanes. It seems to come on unusually early in a DA40, which is probably a good thing though, isn't it? You know, the earlier that comes on, the more chance of recovering before an actual stall. Did I hear something else? Someone not necessarily fully aft, but yes, stick aft, yep. Anything else? Sorry? Yep. Anything else?
The nose will pitch down.
Anything else? I think we've covered them all there. So there's lots, eh? So really highlight, there's a lot of different things that should be indicating to us that we are getting close to the minimum speed of the aeroplane. So we should be learning these for situational awareness so that we never accidentally stall. This is a tangent, but I'll ask you, what is either the or the only one or the only few consistent symptoms of a stall up here? Which things always happen
Sync.
in every single aeroplane? Yeah. That is the only consistent symptom of a stall. Everything else depends on the situation, depends on the aeroplane. If we're doing a dynamic stall, well, the airspeed's not going to be low, it's going to be really high. The nose attitude's going to be pretty low. It's not going to be quiet. The controls will be very effective. The stall warning won't come on until the point of stall. Stick doesn't need to be fully aft because the controls are so effective. Buffet may not happen until the point of stall. And the nose doesn't always pitch down in every single aeroplane. So that is the consistent symptom. You don't have to go through that with your students, but it is important that you know that, because remember, this is lesson number 2 of about 5 stall lessons, so it's helpful for you to know that. Okay, so run through the symptoms. Recovery, again, I usually get them to come up on the whiteboard, write all that stuff out, because there's lots of similarities. Ask them about what's the most important thing they have to do. What is the only thing that recovers an aeroplane from a stall? If they don't understand that, there's a big problem. It basically means go back and do the basic stalls lesson all over again. Relax the back pressure. So terminology wise, as I mentioned, when you patter this in an aeroplane, you will most likely say check forward, because that's 2 words versus 3 words for reduced back pressure. But always describe to them that what you mean is a relaxation of the back pressure rather than an abrupt check forward. That's all that's usually required. Hopefully they've remembered aileron central. You might get a question about that, so keep it simple. We don't want this stall to develop into anything unusual. Okay, we'll deal with more advanced stalls later on. So aileron central, applying full power. Ask them about that. Why do we apply full power? Oh, we want to minimize height loss. Why would we want to do that? Because we're most likely to stall when we are close to the ground. So it comes back to your objectives, right? Minimal height loss. So relate it back to that. Raise the nose to the horizon. You'll see some people say at a safe speed, raise the nose to the horizon. Get away from that, okay? We don't need to say that because there is no such safe speed. As soon as you've lowered the nose, the aeroplane is unstalled. And as soon as you see the airspeed rising, it is time to start pitching the nose back to the horizon. Not aggressively, but that is when you know you can do that. Retract flap to the takeoff position. Check the aircraft is accelerating. And here's where that weird wording comes in, sufficient speed. We're just wanting to get away from the stall speed. So make sure it is actually accelerating. Then we can retract flap to up, set the climb attitude and regain our altitude. but always relate this to being in the circuit. So if this actually happened to us coming into land, we wouldn't just level off at a couple of 100 feet, we would climb up to circuit altitude, figure out why that happened and make sure it doesn't happen ever again. A real tangent here, but in the US they teach this stall completely different to us. So initially it's the same, they'll reduce the power, start slowing down, they set flat, but when they hear the stall warning, they set full power and keep pitching up to actually simulate that you've just taken off, and they go right through to the stall. So you do end up with a relatively high nose attitude and potentially a wind drop. But they teach that over there. And there's probably some value in that. And there's lots of different reasons why we don't teach it though. Different countries do different things. Your choice where you go here. Okay, ask some questions around what's the basic stall speed, what were maybe a targeted question about some of the factors, anything else that you might want to ask about. Maybe it's to do with symptoms, but really highlighting that the aeroplane always stalls at the critical angle of attack, but the speed varies. Homework would be to go away and memorise the entry and recovery. What I would do with them now is introduce them to the flight manual, show them where to find all these different references to the stall speed and the turn, the different weights with flap set. So you're wanting them to get used to how to use all of that stuff. Do you have questions? All right. Slow flight one written. Everyone got a copy of the briefing?
Yeah.
So with that one, with this briefing, just really highlight that 53 knots that you talked about in the basic stalls briefing is an important reference, okay? It's not going to be the stall speed every single time you go flying, but it's still an important reference for awareness.
You need to mention what it's based on.
What's that?
You need to mention what it is based on.
In the basic stalls briefing, we should. Yep. What is it based on?
Next one, I believe. That's up. Hello.
This is another one where this lesson is done will vary from organisation to organisation. Where I used to instruct in Hauora, we would do slow flight before basic stalls and before approach stalls, but other organisations will do the stall lessons first and then they'll go to slow flight. So it does change. Get to know what your organisation does. I don't know in the CAA Flight Instructor Guide where it actually sits, I can't remember. It's either before or after though. It's very closely related to the stall briefs though. And there's a lot of crossover, so it makes sense that it should be done around the same time. Some people like to do it before because it introduces the student to the concept of what the aeroplane will look like and feel like close to its minimum speed. Others like to do it afterwards because now that they've actually experienced the aeroplane at its minimum speed, they'll find slow flight a little bit easier. So there's benefits of doing it either way. Okay, instructional techniques things first. Probably most of this I can just talk about in the intro, I think. Yeah, just in the intro. Move that to there. Really, for you guys, the big thing I want to highlight here is it's not an operational exercise. At no point would we ever want to practically go flying around at just above the minimum speed. That's how this lesson was taught to me when I was a student, that, hey, well, ATC might tell you they want you to slow down, so yeah, we'll slow right down to the stall speed and fly around. That is not what you want to teach a student, that is not what the CAA wants, and that is not what this lesson is all about. So it's not an operational lesson, but it relates to so many different phases of flight every single time you go flying. That's why it's relevant. Have you not got one, DS?
No.
Did you have one and now it's gone, or?
Yeah,
You did.
So few pages just flew away.
What's that?
So few pages just disappeared.
Yeah. I'll let you try and find that so you can write notes. You only tuck it into the rest of the pages there. I'll print you out another one. Oh, you got it? Okay. So that's something for you to be aware of. It's not an operational exercise. I tend to think of slow flight as advanced straight and level with turning. That's how I think of it, because it really just flows on from the straight and level lesson. In fact, back in the day, this lesson was not a standalone thing. You looked at everything we're going to discuss today in the straight and level lesson back in the day. It really relies upon you having taught the straight and level lesson well. If you didn't, then they're really going to struggle with this. Objectives, so there's a lot of similarities with straight and level flight, but you're just highlighting different configurations. So by that we mean different flap settings. We'll talk about the benefits of those. This is just like, what are we talking about here? Medium turns there and returning to normal airspeed. Nothing unusual there, but it's a great lesson for improving their straight and level skills. So if they're good at this, there's no reason why they shouldn't be good at normal straight and level flight as well. There's a couple of slides like this one which give a bit of context to why they need to know it. So really emphasize the different phases of flight to them, which I'll talk about when I actually deliver it to you. Recap on straight and level flight, so ask them questions here. You shouldn't have to do all the talking here. Something to emphasize would be the size of these two vectors, thrust and drag. Now, obviously this is a bit ridiculous, but it's to make a point that there actually is still quite a lot of thrust, even though our airspeed is really slow. Because there's so much drag, we need a lot of thrust. So it's exaggerated, but it's to make a point, and that's okay so long as you explain that. We come back to this thing and this, so you could ask questions around that. So there's a lot of revision. This should almost all be revision. When you get to the end of this slide, just pause there and start introducing some of these things. So start talking about control effectiveness, because one click brings up from memory this whole slide and we'll give them all the answers, okay? So control effectiveness is the first one, and you'll see it coming up on the speaker notes. So ask them about, hey, when they were doing effects of controls, what did they notice when we were flying slow? Get them to describe everything they remember, okay? You don't need to do that. Fill in any blanks that you have to though. Adverse yaw, you've done medium turns, so you've introduced them to that. So talk about, well, what's relevant here? Why is it more pronounced? They won't know why it's more pronounced, so you'll have to explain that one. Why is it more pronounced? Controls are less effective, so won't you need to use more aileron? The more aileron you use, the more adverse yaw there will be. So that's the reason behind that one. Does it say it down there? No, I don't think it does, but that's the answer to that. Slipstream, ask them a question around that, well, what is it? What does it do? What's the effect of that power? Highlight that we have a reasonable amount of power on slow flight, so there's going to be a tendency to want to yaw. So lots of rudder is required, lots and lots and lots of rudder. Highlight the drag, they have been introduced to some things in relation to drag, but highlighting that high angle of attack, lots of drag, we control speed with power, more flexible use of power. You've talked all about stall speeds before, so really highlighting here that we're operating close to the minimum speed. In fact, the CAA recommends that you teach this at 1.2 VS. I don't know what that works out to be in a DA40, probably 65 odd knots, but very close to the minimum speed. So a healthy awareness of that speed and the factors that affect it, as well as the symptoms of the stall, is important. And then you can recap on FLAP because they have learned about this stuff already. So revision, lots of it. Some of this will be revision as well. I'm safe, you're highlighting that stress is probably a big thing here because of the information processing. Look, everything they do in this lesson, they've already learned how to do. They know how to fly straight level, they know how to turn. You've taught them all of that before and they're competent at it. Why is it so difficult then? It's because the control inputs are different. There's different nose attitudes and they can't see very well out front. So that's why it's so busy. Some of the rest, I think I'll just talk about the rest of that in the presentation. Nothing else I really need to talk about there. This slide, things to emphasize, this high RPM, just say it's so that the propeller operates efficiently. You do need to have a bit of background knowledge behind that, so what I suggest you do is when I see someone deliver this, I will ask you why the propeller is more efficient at high RPM. Have a think about that, consult your propeller notes from last semester and try to figure out why you would want high RPM set and not a coarser position. With regard to the throttle on here, you're just really emphasizing that coordinated inputs between throttle and attitude are required. Angle of bank, max 20, why is that? Why do you think? Any ideas?
Is it load factor?
Yep, what about it?
It's going to increase the stall speed, so we're going to get even closer to it.
Correct, yeah, the margin becomes unacceptable, you know, it goes from 1.2 to 1.1 or nothing and we stall, right? And then the SOPs is really important to discuss here. I'll talk more about that when I actually present it. I still, as a junior instructor, get students coming up to me having no knowledge of this, and it's probably actually instructors' fault for not introducing the students that we have SOP guidance around slow flight. So I don't want that to be you guys when you're instructing. This is just a wasted slide really, just to introduce what you're going to do in the actual aircraft. The air exercise part, you come back to your power plus attitude equals performance, you can ask questions about that. Then you talk more specifics, how are we actually going to get the aeroplane set up? So it kind of is power, attitude, power trim. It's not actually just power, attitude, trim, because once you get to your target speed, you actually have to increase the power a little bit. So just highlight that. It's actually like power, attitude, power trim. That's the big thing to emphasize there. Maintaining, only new thing, or only additional concept there is that you want them to keep that cycle going rapidly, continuously and rapidly, because they can't see much. So the quicker they can do that scan, the sooner they'll notice anything changing. Yeah, not really anything here to talk about. And again, just, I don't know if you remember from when you were taught, but it's always full power when you're recovering from slow flight, even in the clean configuration, always full power. Probably all, I think, for instructional techniques. So I'll go back to the start and give you some ideas of how to present it, particularly with regard to the introduction. So gauge when they last did the stalling lessons, because you will ask questions from those lessons here. By the way, another good resource to give your students at the end of the briefing might actually be a copy of the briefing itself. I think I mentioned the Waypoints book with all of the different exercises in it, but you could also copy that off for them as well so they can take it away and read it. You know, the students have access to Flight Pro here, so it's not such a problem. So today is slow flight, and I like to think of this as advanced straight level flight with some turning. There are a range of phases of flight every time we go flying where you have to operate the aeroplane close to its minimum speed. So what do I mean by minimum speed? Do you remember what that is? Hopefully they'll say stall speed. Oh, what's that speed? 53 knots, bit of revision there, right? Why is this so important when we're operating close to that speed? We've got to have a very healthy awareness of what the aeroplane feels like and even what it looks like when operating at that speed. We need to be careful with our coordination, particularly of the elevator and the power. We don't want to mishandle the aeroplane and inadvertently stall it when we are flying that slow. This is also an important exercise for your confidence. With regular practice, you will become more confident in operating the aeroplane at these speeds. So phases of flight I'm talking about, takeoff and landing. Every single time we go flying, you are operating close to the minimum speed. If we didn't actually do a slow flight lesson, the student does not get enough time to practice and actually gain confidence in how the aeroplane handles at those slow speeds, because really it's stalls that would be the other lesson where you would do this, and you're only flying slow for a brief amount of seconds before you actually stall. So this is why there's actually a separate lesson for it. So it's not an operational lesson, okay? We never actually want to be deliberately flying around at or very close to our minimum speed. It relates to so many other phases of flight, which is why we learn it. This briefing will take us about 25 to 30 minutes to get through. Here are our objectives. Some of them may look relatively familiar. To maintain straight and level flight at low airspeeds this time and in different aircraft configurations. So we'll have a look at this exercise with flap extended and without flap extended to compare the benefits. Also going to be looking at turning the aeroplane at slow speeds whilst maintaining a constant altitude, and you'll really be able to draw on your knowledge that you learned in the ancillary controls lessons, the effects of the ancillary controls, the importance of trimming, the effects of power. It is all going to be very relevant to this lesson. This is a great lesson for practicing coordination. And then we're going to look at returning to normal operating speed as well. So some considerations why we want to practice this. I've mentioned 2 phases of flight already where these skills you're going to learn today are relevant. What we're really aiming to do today is improve your awareness of what the aircraft feels like and how it handles and what it even looks like to be operating close to its minimum speed. So it flows on quite nicely from the stall lessons. Careful coordination and handling is required of the aeroplane at this speed so we don't accidentally stall. It's a great exercise to practice coordination, so it'll really improve your skills at straight level flight and even medium turns. It's relevant to not only the takeoff and landing, but also to the stalling lessons for a procedure we call a go-around, which is an aborted landing, and even a bounce recovery, which is where the landing hasn't gone so well. At those phases of flight, we're operating very close to the stall speed. Careful handling is required. When you actually do this flight, I usually give them a scenario like a bounce recovery. I take them out to the training area at altitude, simulate that we're on an approach to land, simulate a big bounce by pulling back quite firmly on the stick. You know, we're up at altitude like you would be for a stall, and then showing them recovery and showing how long it actually takes the aeroplane to accelerate, how big the rudder and elevator inputs have to be in order to prevent and how careful you need to be with the elevator to prevent a stall. So that's an example of a scenario you can use to actually keep it practical. So a bit of revision. We've had a look at the forces acting on the aeroplane in straight and level flight before, so can you tell me all the forces? Hopefully they're able to rattle those off to you, okay? Recap on those. Again. So there are the four forces required to be in equilibrium if we're to maintain a constant speed. Now, this looks a little bit different than normal straight and level, doesn't it? Look how big the thrust and drag is now. We've exaggerated it a little bit here, but it's to make a point that even though we might be flying much slower, what do we normally do in straight and level flight? About 120 knots. What's our stall speed? 53 knots. So even though our airspeed may have halved, we will still have a reasonable amount of power and thrust required in order to maintain that speed because the drag is so high. We have all of this frontal surface area now exposed to the oncoming airflow, creating lots of drag, requiring lots of thrust. To revisit one of the principles from straight and level flight, if we want to fly at a slower than normal airspeed, we're going to require a higher than normal nose attitude. And in order to slow down, we'll first have to reduce the power. Eventually, we will settle on a low airspeed where our performance will still be straight and level flight, but at a lower specific speed. It's helpful to remind ourselves of this formula as well. So the aeroplane weighs a certain amount, we have to have lift equal to weight in order to be in straight and level flight. So as we slow down, we have to increase the angle of attack in order to keep it in level flight. Nothing new there, right? So you can ask questions about all of that. It finishes off with a bit of an animation, I think. Yep, there it is. We need to recap on some important principles. So can you remember from the effects of controls lesson how the aeroplane felt when we were flying around at slow speed? What did you notice? Oh yeah, it was sluggish. Big inputs were required to control the aeroplane. Controls weren't very effective. Light control forces. Big inputs required. So that's really important for you to remember because when we're operating in those phases of flight where we are close to the stall speed, bigger inputs will be required, but you don't want to over control the aeroplane or be too abrupt because you could cause an inadvertent stall. Do you remember what adverse yaw was? We learned about that in medium turns. Hopefully they're able to tell you a little bit about it. Adverse yaw is really relevant to this lesson. Because we're flying so slow, when we are using ailerons, much larger inputs are required and your adverse yaw is going to increase. Big rudder inputs are required to prevent this adverse yaw. So you'll need to anticipate that. Again, ask them about slipstream, as I talked about before. The combination of the low speed and the relatively high power setting is going to mean the aeroplane continuously wants to yaw. How are you going to prevent that? You'll probably find you continuously need to apply rudder to prevent yaw. One of the real odd things the students have to get their head around when you're actually in the aeroplane is that sometimes you do a left-hand turn and you don't need any left rudder. You actually need right rudder because the slipstream has a much bigger effect. I don't generally tell them that in the briefing, but in the air, point that out to them because they'll inevitably put way too much rudder in, thinking, oh yeah, controls are less effective. So you've got to introduce them to that as well. We've talked about how there's a lot of drag, so we're going to maintain our target speed with power. Power as required to maintain that speed. And like I've said already, we are operating close to the stall speed, so a very healthy awareness is needed of that reference speed, careful handling of the aeroplane, and we're going to need to always have in the back of our mind what the symptoms are. We will see a lot of those symptoms today, but we will be controlling the aeroplane to prevent the stall from actually occurring today. And it's important to remain in balance. We learned a little bit about flaps recently. We'll have a look at slow flight with flap extender today. One of the big benefits is that it increases the visibility because it allows a lower nose attitude. It will also enable us to fly around at a slightly slower speed. And we have SOP guidance around that, which I will talk to you about in one of the slides coming up. By this stage, you've had plenty of consideration of I'm safe, but I want to highlight the S here. even though you've learned how to fly straight and level, you've learned medium turns, you've learned all about effective controls and ancillary controls before, there is a high workload and a high concentration associated with the lesson today because the nose attitudes will be different. Many things will be happening at once, requiring you to think about them and to anticipate them. And to top it off, the nose attitude is high, so you struggle to see where you're going. So it's quite normal for you to feel overwhelmed in this exercise, but we'll get regular practice and you'll find it gets easier and easier. One helpful technique to avoid becoming overwhelmed and to be able to detect if anything is changing when it shouldn't be is to ensure that you keep this activity cycle, lookout, attitude instruments going continuously and rapidly. So you have a greater likelihood of noticing things changing and be able to fix them before they create a bigger problem. You're not going to have a very good visibility if we are cruising around without flap extended at slow speed. So you need to be vigilant. This is still a visual maneuver, so most of your time should be spent still looking outside. You may find you have to lean forward in your seat in order to see over the cowling, or you may find you have to make a series of turns in order to actually see what's down in front of you. We must continue to maintain the imageship of traffic, terrain, cloud, like always. For this exercise, we always set high RPM. This is so the propeller can operate more efficiently. Mixture will stay full rich. The throttle controls the speed, and you'll find you have to make coordinated adjustments between the throttle to maintain speed and the attitude to maintain your altitude. You're often adjusting both of those at the same time. We never roll to an angle of bank greater than 20 degrees. There's several reasons for this. We're operating close to the minimum level flight speed. Now what happened to the stall speed in the turn? Oh yeah, it rises, doesn't it? So that gets us even closer to the stall speed. Unacceptably close, and we don't want to accidentally stall. But if we limit the angle of bank to 20 degrees, the rise in the stall speed is minimal. And we'll spend a lot longer in future lessons talking about this consideration. I mentioned that we have some SOPs. Whatever speed we use for slow flight, whether it be flap extended or no flap extended, the stall warning should not be going off continuously. There are two speeds in the SOPs. Suggests that we use 60 knots when we have flap extended and 65 knots in the clean configuration. But again, if the stall warning is going off at either of those speeds, what we'll do is increase the power, accelerate to a slightly faster speed, whatever is required to silence the stall warning, and that will become your new target speed for slow flight. And this will change from day to day. It will not always be the same speed that you can use. This is what we're going to have a look at in flight. Slow flights in the clean configuration with flap extended, including straight and level flight and turns, and also how to re-establish normal cruise flight. It doesn't come up in here, but what you also are going to have to do out of necessity with students is talk about how to get back to their reference altitude, because they'll inevitably lose 100 or 200 feet, and you need to talk them through the process of actually getting back to their altitude whilst maintaining the correct airspeed. And this is a really practical bit, because if you think about it, flying level in slow flight does not relate to any practical phase of flight. When do we ever do that? Practically, we don't, do we? We certainly don't. On takeoff, landing, go around, bounce recovery, no. We're climbing or descending, aren't we? So in my opinion, it would actually be really valuable to teach this in a climb or descent, but that's my opinion. We don't do that. So this is your exercise to expand on it. Once again, coming back to power plus attitude equals performance. If we want to fly at a slower than normal speed, we must set a higher than normal attitude, and we must reduce the power in order to slow down. To look at this in a little bit more specific detail, to enter slow flight, we're going to pick ourselves a reference point, something that's easy to see, so either something that you can see down the side of the cowling or something high in the sky, and ensure that we've done a thorough lookout, because with the higher nose attitude we won't be able to see hazards as easily. We'll pick a reference altitude. Think of the entry as power, attitude, power, trim. So we're going to reduce the power initially to approximately 12 inches, keep straight, maintain altitude, a bit like your stall entries that you've learned so far. As we slow down, we'll raise the nose attitude. The aeroplane will continue to slow down, getting closer to our target speed. Through 80 knots, we set high RPM. As we approach our target speed, we will increase the power slightly to stop the aeroplane slowing down any further. So it's a bit like in a car really. If you think about it, when you want to slow down in a car, you take your foot off the accelerator. Once the car's actually reached the speed, you've got to put your foot back on the accelerator to stop it slowing down anymore. And it's exactly the same thing in an aeroplane with this exercise. Like I said before, if the stall warning is heard, we're going to increase the power, accelerate to a slightly faster speed. That becomes our new target speed. And we want to trim. Trim promptly and trim completely, because the workload is high enough without having to fight an untrimmed aeroplane. To maintain slow flight, just like straight and level flight, is lookout attitude instruments. The only difference being you want a more rapid scan. It's harder to see, high workload. You want to detect any changes happening to your altitude or to your airspeed sooner, so you can fix them before they become a bigger problem. You could expand on that a little bit more, ask them about which instruments they think would be useful if you want. We're also going to have a look at how to turn, some of the considerations around turning at slow speed. So in the medium turns lesson, you learned about lift. Ask them some questions around that. Either what do we have to do to lift in the turn, or why do we have to increase lift in the turn? Some sort of question. What we didn't discuss very much in the medium turns briefing though is that this increase in lift also increases the drag. Now in a medium turn, when we're at 120 knots, we don't really care so much about that increase in drag because we're way above the minimum speed. No problem, but in slow flight we are very close to the minimum speed and there's even more drag. So it's a very important consideration. The increased drag will mean we have to increase the power to maintain our speed. So as we roll in, we will need to increase the power to maintain speed, and as we roll out, we'll need to anticipate that there'll be less drag, so we reduce the power as we roll out. We mentioned already that we limit the angle of act to 20 degrees to prevent an inadvertent stall. We've highlighted that the controls are less effective, so what I really want to emphasize here is to make things easier for you, roll in slowly, and as an instructor, make sure you demonstrate a slow entry, because it's really hard if you roll in rapidly to actually coordinate it. So roll in slowly. You're expecting to need to use large inputs in order to get the aeroplane to respond. Large aileron inputs, large rudder inputs, large elevator inputs. And we need to prevent the adverse yaw. So this is where what you learned in ancillary controls comes in. When you add power, the aeroplane's going to want to yaw, so you need to prevent it and also think about the adverse yaw. Once we're finished turning, we want to return to normal cruise flight. We always set full power, regardless if any flap is set. Keep straight, gradually lower the nose to the level attitude. Gradually is important, okay, just like leveling off from a climb, we don't just suddenly check forward, because otherwise we'll descend. You'll find you have to hold a lot of forward pressure on the stick as the aeroplane accelerates. Feel free to give it a couple of winds forward on the trim to help you out there, to make it a bit easier. And as the airspeed passes through 100 knots, reset the training power to 22 inches, 2,200 RPM, and then you can fine tune the trim. If you did have any flap set, retract that after setting full power, one stage at a time. That's it. Nice short brief. 25 minutes maximum, I would say. So really draw on what they were taught in the previous stalling lessons and basic controls and ancillary controls, because there's really not a lot of new things here. discuss just why I think teaching this in level flight is not as practical is that's a flight test exercise. A flight test requires that a student maintains their altitude to within 100 feet when they do this, and their airspeed to within 5 knots. Now, I agree with the airspeed bit, but like I said, practically, we're never going to be flying level at this speed, so actually doing this in a climb and descent would actually be much more practical, because when you are climbing or descending, how do you control your airspeed? It's not power, is it? This briefing tells you that it's power that controls airspeed, and that is correct, but it's only correct for level flight. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the practical phases of flight, being climbing and descending, and level flight. You're teaching them the wrong things in a way. So we control our speed with attitude in climbing and descending, and we control our altitude with power in climbing and descending. It's the opposite in level flight, Just food for thought. You don't even have to talk to a student about that. Just if I had them, way you teach them in climb and descend as well. Do you have any questions on that?